So FiiO's R2R Warmer DAC, why is it so popular, and is it really that good? Well, part of the obvious reason that it's popular is because it uses an old style R2R ladder DAC and vacuum tubes for the output stage, and it has actual analog VU meters on the front. So it's not surprising that for only $350 that it's become very popular. However, it does have some limitations. It was a fun project for FiiO to make, and I think it even surprised them that it became so popular, and so they've had to ramp up production of it. And the impression I got from James at FiiO was that it wasn't really made to make a big profit on, and so maybe that's why it's so relatively inexpensive and actually so simple, because it is literally only a DAC. It is not like the K17 it's sitting on behind me, which has a bunch of electronics and other features inside. The FiiO R2R Warmer basically has USB, optical or coaxial digital input, and analog output, and that's it. There's nothing else you can really change. Other than the inputs, you can only switch on or off the digital filter via a switch at the back, or switch it into UAC1 mode if you want to plug it into something that requires it, like a game console, or if you're one of those people who still uses Windows 7. So really that's all it does. Its limitations are so much, for example, that the VU meters on the front are lit up with a light. Now, if you're one of those people who likes to listen in a dark room, say at nighttime, you may find that that light is actually quite bright, and you may want to cover over the front panel or even put some kind of dimming material on there if necessary. If you're hoping for something like a digital volume control or anything like that, well, that's not going to work either because it just doesn't have one. There is also one other limitation in that because the output stage is tube-based, that the sound is going to sound slightly different depending on what you plug it into. It's a factor of output impedance and input impedance. Now, usually the output impedance of a source device is a lot lower than the input impedance of an amplifier, which will usually be in the kilo ohms, like 2 kilo ohms or more. If the input impedance of your amplifier is a little bit low, then there will be a little bit of bass roll-off from the FiiO R2R Warmer. And I saw at least one blog where someone reviewed it and tested this using an analyzer simulating different input impedances and found that there was a little bit of bass roll-off in the low bass from the R2R Warmer with a lower impedance input. So that's something to note. And I noticed it with the occasional amp here when I was comparing the XLR output versus the RCA outputs. Probably the input impedance of the amp I was using was different from both different inputs, and as a result the RCA input sounded like it had a little bit less bass. But maybe the main factor about why would you buy an R2R DAC, technically they are not as either sophisticated or as accurate as modern Sigma Delta DACs, and I think that's a big factor, but the real factor is in how they present the music. Now, an R2R DAC, for the unfamiliar, if you know how standard audio sampling works, basically you have music sampled at 44,100 times or more per second, and each sample results in a 16 or 24-bit word, that is a 16 or 24-bit binary number, a bunch of zeros and ones as we tend to imagine it. If you map those zeros and ones onto switches for the resistor ladder, with each resistor pair on the ladder having double, or depending which way you look at it, double or half the resistance, you get the actual analog signal coming out of the DAC at the end. However, it does require some digital filtering, ideally before it is mapped onto the resistor ladder, because the output tends to be very inaccurate, which is non-oversampling mode. And that mode tends to be very soft and forgiving while not very technically accurate, while at least some oversampling. A resistor ladder, due to the limitations of the physical components, can't really meet even a 16-bit audio. In more sophisticated DACs, they use multiple ladders, multiple resistors, and other mechanisms for overcoming those issues. But in a simple R2R ladder DAC, such as the Warmer, you don't have anything like that at all. But still, why at $350 would you buy one? And I think the major factor is the sound. At $350, if I buy a DAC that uses an ESS Tech, AKM, Cirrus Logic or similar DAC chip, then to me it feels like I'm not really listening to the music but a digital reproduction of the music. Much like you can see the trees out of the window behind me, but you can tell by looking at them that you're looking through a window at the trees. It's not the same as being outside and looking at the trees. And I feel much the same way listening to music through a regular DAC. However, an R2R DAC does make you feel like you're listening to the music rather than to a reproduction of the music. and I think that's a big factor in why they are popular. With the R2R Warmer, I really find the name Warmer a little bit, well, inaccurate. I don't really think it's a warm DAC as such. If you've just switched from listening with something like a $350 Sigma Delta based DAC, then maybe it does sound more forgiving and proverbially warmer, although if you switch on the oversampling mode, it does sound a touch more accurate. Very similar to Cayenne's RU6 R2R dongle DAC when you switch oversampling on that as well. It does sound a touch more accurate, but it's not a dramatic difference. I think the main factor for me was that I could plug it into my system and listen to music and not feel like I was listening to the equipment, but actually listening to the music. This will probably make a lot more sense if I compare it with other DACs. Now behind me, below the Aone N7 amp, is Topping's Centaurus R2R DAC. Now I was supposed to review that, except that the screen on that decided to stop working, or something decided to stop working in that. But the DAC itself still works, so I could A/B compare them at the same listening level, and I found that the R2R Warmer was only a little bit behind Topping's Centaurus in terms of how it sounded. The Centaurus was maybe a little bit clearer, a little bit better sounding overall, whether I was listening with headphones or my KEF LS50 system through an Audio GD amp. But still, it wasn't a dramatic difference. Probably the Topping's main advantage is you have way more features and way more options in what you can do with it. Whereas the R2R Warmer, of course, you only have basically input and output, and that's it. Another DAC, of course, is Schiit Audio's Bifrost 264, which is sitting below the Centaurus. That was an interesting one, as I felt that the Bifrost 264 wasn't quite as warm sounding as the original Bifrost 2. If anything, it was a little bit maybe cleaner, clearer, and actually close to the Topping D70 Pro Octave. But interestingly, A/B comparing it with the FiiO Warmer through my system, I found actually the Bifrost felt fuller and that there was more music coming through from the Bifrost 2, but I think it was a different kind of presentation versus the FiiO R2R Warmer, which sounded a little bit thinner and drier versus the Bifrost 2. That made me feel as an R2R DAC that the FiiO Warmer was not so much warmer as such, but I probably use, especially with the oversampling switched on, a little bit more on the dry side, closer to classic R2R DACs such as Schiit Audio's Yggdrasil Analog 2, which I still have in here. Compared to HiFiMan's Serenade DAC and Amp, if I just used the Serenade as a DAC to an amp and compared it with the FiiO R2R Warmer, there was a very similar presentation where both I felt were good at just presenting the music with maybe a sense of depth, maybe a little bit more sense of realism. Compare that, of course, to something like FiiO's K17, where if I used the R2R Warmer as a DAC to the K17 and compared it with the inbuilt DAC in the K17, the inbuilt DAC maybe had a bit more detail and it was a bit more neutral and a bit more maybe accurate sounding, with that touch of what they maybe that velvet sound that the AKM DACs tend to promote. But where I might lose a little bit of detail from the R2R Warmer, it did sound to me easier and a little bit more, in a sense, musical to listen with. Whereas the K17's DAC was maybe a little bit less in what I might describe as interesting. I often use the Serenade as a DAC to my main system when I just want to listen casually and know that I'll enjoy music from it, and FiiO's R2R Warmer brings a similar kind of presentation to the music that makes it, again, easy to listen with. Interestingly, a DAC which is closest in sound to the FiiO R2R Warmer was DCS's Lena DAC. Now, just for fun, I plugged the FiiO R2R Warmer into the buffered input of the DCS Lena amp. That has a higher input impedance and is very suited to something like the FiiO R2R Warmer. And I did A/B compare them, since I can adjust the volume very easily on the Lena DAC to match things exactly. The result, interestingly, was that they are very similar sounding in how they present music. However, the Lena DAC obviously has a lot more detail, where if you're listening to music which are very high quality recordings, for example, you can clearly hear more depth to the music, better sound stage, and more instrument detail from that through the Lena DAC, obviously. But given that they are so close in how they sound, for some music which does not have that much to present, say like some rock music and older recordings where they just aren't as well made, then there was much less of a difference to be had. So funnily enough, I described the FiiO Warmer as a mini DCS Lena DAC in terms of how it presents music. But what was most striking from the R2R Warmer is that, again, I could plug it into anything, any of the amps I have, and enjoy listening music through it without having that feeling of wanting to tweak and adjust and worry about what I was listening with. I could just enjoy what music I was listening to. An interesting combination actually you'll see next to the R2R Warmer behind me is Aone's N7 amp. Now interestingly, FiiO have planned to make a Class A amp to match the FiiO R2R Warmer and are working on that at the moment. But they didn't prioritize that so much because they hadn't expected that the R2R Warmer would be so popular. Now, combining the FiiO R2R Warmer with something like the Aone N7, which is a very punchy and relatively inexpensive Class A amp, and something like the final DX4000CL headphones behind me, that kind of system ends up being, at under $1,500, a really excellent and enjoyable system. You have the musical quality of the FiiO R2R Warmer, which is one that you don't have to think about what you're listening with. You have the very punchy and enjoyable, if not so wide sounding, N7 amp, and since the final DX4000CLs don't have a big sound stage that needs a big wide sounding amp, but definitely does benefit from the punchy delivery of the Class A amp in the N7, the result was very enjoyable to listen to music with. Of course, you're not going to be nitpicking out the fine details of the violins in something like Julia Fischer's Sarasate or whatever, or be able to hear every echo of every note off the venue when someone plays an instrument in a classical or jazz recording. But especially with more modern music, that system was very enjoyable to listen with. So with the only caveat that you may get a little bit of bass roll-off depending what you plug the R2R Warmer into, and that you only get basically a DAC, the R2R Warmer is an easy DAC to get and plug into a system and enjoy listening to music with, and one that you don't have to overthink how you use it. So if you get an R2R Warmer, which I hope you'll do through the links in the description, which will help out my channel, do let me know in the comments now or later how it worked out for you, or if you're watching this to see what I think of it and you already have an R2R Warmer, do post your comments below. I'd really like to hear from you. Thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online or at the Can Jam.